In this nugget, we take a look simply at how to configure Windows Firewall. This will mostly be working with the UI in taking a look at the various ways to configure the firewall, but primarily we'll be working with Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, either as a standalone item in a local computer, or using a group policy object, which is the more common implementation. Well, I have a dear neighbor across the street. It's an elderly couple, actually, and they moved from, I think, upstate New York or someplace on the East Coast. Very nice people. However, I have to be honest with you, sometimes it's a little difficult to talk with them. I mentioned this years ago in a different nugget that I recorded for CBT Nuggets as well. But my friend here will sometimes talk to me, and he's one of those people that gets right in your space. There's no sense of a personal bubble with this person. Maybe it's because he grew up on the East Coast and everybody's all crowded into subways and stuff like that. So anyway, he gets very close, and he also kind of spits when he talks. So it's a little uncomfortable sometimes. I remember even one time, back when I used to ride a bicycle, when I pretended to be an active adult, I rode my bike by his house, and he flagged me down and wanted to have a conversation about something. And I kept trying to put my bicycle wheel in the front between me and him, but he would keep coming around to the side, again, right next to me. It was at that time I really wished that I could come up with a firewall to block my neighbor. Fortunately, we have something in Windows Server 2012 that will help to prevent various kinds of interactions. Alright, as we get started here, the first thing I want to really address is the various ways that you can get to the firewall. There are a number of different interfaces. The first way would simply be Control Panel. I'll just demonstrate these as we go, I think. So if I go to the desktop here on my Windows Server 2012 machine, I can go into the Control Panel here, and then Network and Internet, or System and Security. They both actually have a way of allowing you to get there. And then by clicking on Windows Firewall, you can see that I have the opportunity here to specify for guest or public networks, private networks, and domain networks, which, as you can see here, is what I'm currently connected to. I'm going to be describing in brief here as well the difference between all of these. But for the time being, just notice that the firewall is on. I haven't messed with it or done anything to it. These are all just the default things that take place with it. Now, what we can get with this is really only general settings. You cannot do a great deal of detail in this interface. For example, notice that I could say turn firewall on or off. Okay, I guess I could turn it off if I didn't want to have it on for some reason or another. Generally speaking, we do want to leave the firewall on so that we can protect ourselves. As you can see here in the background, I did a netstat-a. That means it's showing me all ports on this server, and in this case, which ones are established or listening. And you can see here that, for example, it's listening on port 80. Now, as you probably already know, that's the port that's used, TCP, that's used for listening for web requests. Okay, so I've got a web server installed here, and obviously it's listening the way it's supposed to be. However, we do want to lock down any other ports that's really not supposed to be open. So you do have to comb through that on sometimes on servers to see what ports are there, and you might need to know which ones are well-known ports as well. But we could turn off the firewall if we wanted to, and if we did that, then we would be pretty much open to having some attack on just about any port. Hackers over the network do need usually some kind of a port in order to be able to gain access. Usually they will use a port that's already open and being used by a service such as port 80. It's just that when they perform their attack, whatever service was using port 80 or whatever it is in the first place will very often become intermittently available or completely unavailable. And that's kind of a red flag that something's going on. So it's better if for a hacker if we turn off Windows Firewall, because then they can just pick whatever port they want, and they can just use anything pretty much. It's not quite that simple, but that gives you the general idea. So generally, we want to leave these on. The only time I would turn them off is if you have a third-party firewall that you are centrally managing in some other way. There may be some kind of a console that they have or some kind of a management system, something like that, to manage this software firewall. Also, don't think to yourself, well, hey, it doesn't really matter to us. We could turn off all of this because, we've got a Cisco firewall that protects us from the internet. Well, that may be. However, you will still have people that will bring in things such as thumb drives into your building that may have viruses on them, or some kind of a Trojan on them that tries to open up a port on a computer and then perhaps communicates with the host on the internet. going outbound. Outbound communications, even through hardware firewalls, are not normally as tightly controlled as inbound ports. So once again, some kind of malware, some kind of a Trojan, something like that, could be inside of your network already and still being doing damage to the local machines or sending private or confidential information out to the internet somewhere. And then notice there's a couple of checkboxes under each one of these as well, which are all the same. But it says, notify me when Windows Firewall blocks a new app. You may have seen this in previous versions of Windows, but that has been turned on in some cases, where anytime you open up something like an email client, which maybe it's using POP email and it checks port 110 over TCP, well, when it does that, it will show a dialog box to the user that they choose allow or not allow, and then that would allow that port to be open and their email to be checked. So this is not really a good idea to leave that checked for the average user on their desktop computers. Generally speaking, I would select that for more computer savvy folks, for people you trust with an allow or disallow decision, that sort of thing. You can also block all incoming connections. That's a little bit far reaching. Generally speaking, if it's on the network at all, it needs to connect somehow to some things, whether they're services or whatever. Otherwise, there's really not much point of it being on the network. Now, notice there's also domain, private, and public settings. I think I'm going to go ahead and cover what those mean here as we take a look at this. Now, look at the names again. Domain, private, and public. What does that correspond to? This. Now, do you see domain, public, and private in this list? No, we see public. Where's domain? Where's private? And you may have seen this dialog box before as well. This is where if you make a new connection, for example, you're on your laptop and you're at a new coffee shop you've never been in before, when you make the connection, it'll ask you where you are. Are you in a public network? Of course, you would choose that in something like a coffee shop. And then what will happen is it does not allow sharing to take place. It does not allow any unsolicited inbound connections and other protections to make sure that you don't have someone from the outside hacking into your computer. At least it's a step in the right direction there. However, these two, we don't really see the same thing. Here's the deal. Microsoft decided to make this as confusing as possible. So when you choose public, what happens in these connection profiles is it actually says public in the interface. Okay? All networks are generally considered public for an added level of protection. However, in that interface, you saw the one that said home. That's actually private. Okay? So home equals private. Okay? So when you choose home here, that equals private. Just to make it a little bit easier, I guess. Anyway, the administrator has to be able to select this. You cannot do this if you are not an administrator. Generally, you'll do this if you are behind a firewall and you already have a first level of protection just from the general internet, for example. And then the last one here is the work option, and that's actually the domain. Okay, the actual name of the network connection profile is domain. However, in the interface here, they call it work. I guess that's just to make it user-friendly or something like that. Now, when you choose work, you could do that manually, and it would give you the similar protections there to what you would get in a private connection. Actually, it's the same. But for the domain, it will choose the domain profile on its own without prompting you if you are also authenticated by a domain controller on that network. So it does that for you, and that's pretty easy. But regardless, when it comes to firewall rules, you'll probably have different rules. For example, when you're in the domain, or in the work environment here, you might want to open up certain ports. Maybe you have a server that contacts your client every now and then that scans it for something. Maybe it scans it for viruses, or maybe it scans it for health checks or something like this. Maybe your client has an agent which needs a certain port open. Okay. However, if you're in a public network, you don't want the same rules to apply. Here you might have 6 or 8 or 10 ports open, but when you're in public, you don't want any of those ports open for unsolicited inbound connections. Okay. So we will have a different profile or different set of firewall rules depending on our connection profile. So anyway, getting back to our firewall interfaces, that's the control panel item, and it just gives you general settings there. You can turn things on and off, and you can turn all ports off if you wanted to using one of those checkboxes. However, you don't have the ability to pick and choose individual ports or anything like that. So for that kind of a thing, you're going to want to go to something called Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, or WFAS. With this, you can specify more granular rules. You can say TCP or UDP or even a specific protocol, protocol number, for example. So those are very, very granular rules. You can also, using WFAS, you can say, hey, I like the set of rules that I've got. Maybe somebody else in my organization can use them. So I'm going to export them to a file, and then maybe email them to them or something like that, and then they can import them on their side of things. To export and import, you can use the UI of WFAS, or you can also use NetShell, which is a common command line utility that we use to perform networking functions. And then for PowerShell, you can also use this. This is new with Windows Server 2012 and Windows 8. You have several different PowerShell commandlets. I give you some of the basics there coming up here, and they all appear on your cheat sheet. We don't need to really review all those in great detail, but let me just drag it over here and show. Or wait a minute. Oh, this is my this is my son's list of jobs that he's supposed to do on Saturday. It's Saturday as I'm recording this, and I forgot I printed that out for him. So anyway, you don't have to do any of those jobs. You can firewall yourself off from doing any of those household chores. So let me drag over this item. There we go. That's what I'm trying to bring in here. This is not complete, by the way. I've got some things I'm going to change in here. Some of these things are just for my reference until we get them finalized. But you can see the firewall settings here. All right there. So that'll give you an idea on how to get started. And again, you can use help with the full parameter there to get more details on some of those specifics. But just so you know, you can use PowerShell. Also, you can use NetShell, as I mentioned earlier. And then, of course, we can use the group policy object, which is kind of where we're going to focus some of our time here in this particular nugget. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit here. Let's catch up with the interface where I talked about Windows Firewall with advanced security. So going back into our control panel again here, as you can see the path up here, there's a couple of things actually I want to show you here. First of all, before I get to WFAS, look at this link. Allow an app or feature through Windows Firewall. Notice that some of these are already selected. Did I select any of these? No, not a one of them. So how did they get selected? Well, anytime you add a Windows feature or a role, it knows that it needs to already open up those ports. Otherwise, for example, I installed IIS on my system here, and I have a website that I want to make available to, the entire internet. So what's happened here is it's automatically checked this for me for both the domain, private, and public. Now, let's just say that this was something that I didn't want available to the public, and I just wanted to make it available to the domain. I can, of course, deselect those items, but very likely this is a web server that's in my own company anyway and inside of my own network. Otherwise, if there was something that it missed or something that someone misconfigured or deselected when they weren't supposed to, maybe they have a RAS server and they didn't select it, so we're going to go ahead and select these items here for routing and remote access. Certainly that is an option. You can also allow another app, and then you can just browse for it using the list of installed apps, or you can browse for it here in the file system as well. And then the other thing that we would have here, this is where we get more current with our current topic of WFAS, is if we could go to the advanced settings. And going into this, we have a lot more granularity in the various settings that we can choose. Notice, first of all, that this is somewhat similar to the basic interface that we looked at earlier. You can kind of just read it and understand what it's doing there. And then you can take a look more specifically at individual inbound and outbound rules. Now, the first thing that we took a look at where we saw the checkboxes, for example, for the World Wide Web Service, well, it didn't say what port that was. It didn't say, a lot of the other specifics there. So if I go down here to the bottom, we can see that there's the World Wide Web Services, item. And if we double click on that, we can see a lot more detail. Also notice that I cannot type in any of this. I'm hitting the keyboard and nothing's happening. These are kind of baked in preset configurations that we could have. If I did not want this particular rule to look exactly the way it does, I would have to disable this one and create my own for HTTP port 80 from scratch here. And you can do that here as well if you want to. Now, we don't really need to memorize everything that appears on every tab here, but I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of what's going on here. Again, of course, I need to make sure I enable that before I forget. We want to allow the connection, but we can also choose allow the connection if it is secure. This works in conjunction with something called connection security rules, and you can see here, if I click on customize, I can say allow it if it's authenticated and integrity protected, or encrypted, or null encapsulation. This basically only authenticates but doesn't provide anything like privacy protection or encryption, anything like that. And then you can also override any block rule. So there may be some of the rules here in the background that are blocking some kind of an access that we need to have, such as remote administration. Well, we could block that. However, if you do that, you have to, as you can see in the description, also specify an authorized computer or computer group, and that comes up in remote computers right here. Okay, so that's the other thing we could do, or of course you can block the connection, but I'm going to go ahead and choose allow. And then the programs and services, this is kind of hard coded in here. You don't really mess with this one, but if you had a specific service or an application package you wanted to make available, or a specific program, you could specify those. Again, that would have to be, in this case, for something that you create from scratch, because you can see it's all dimmed out there. And then for the remote computers, I could say allow only connections from these computers, but watch what happens when I check it. It says you can specify that only when the action is set to allow only secure connections. That refers back to this general page where we have to say if it's secure. That's that item right there. I have to click apply and then go back over to the remote computers tab in order to make that work. And one of the reasons why it has to do that, by the way, is because how does it authenticate those computers? I mean, I can't just check this without having some kind of an authentication mechanism in place. Well, basically, we would use a connection security rule for that, and when we do so in a domain environment, it can use Kerberos tickets. You can also use certificates. You can also use a pre-shared key, that sort of thing. But generally, in an Active Directory domain, we'll use Kerberos tickets because the user and the computer are issued those tickets, which can then be represented to other principals to confirm the identity of the user or computer. You can do it for the computers, you can do it for the remote users. Again, you can pick users out from a domain, for example, or local users as well. One thing that's kind of interesting here, oops, clicked on the wrong tab, is the scope item here, where we can choose which address. Okay, so on a web server, if we really want it to be available, like let's say on the internet, we'd of course choose any IP address. But we can also say only these IP addresses. And with this, you can actually specify a range of addresses. As you can see here, I can say, for example, anything in the 192.168.1.0 network with a 24-bit subnet mask. So that's going to be about 254 hosts on a specific network. Maybe it's a small department and it's their specific web server that they do. Maybe SharePoint, because SharePoint's largely web-based. So maybe they use this for a SharePoint server, and you could specify that, or you could specify just a given IP address. You can also specify remote IP addresses, and then of course here's where your didn't mean to do that. I gotta go back to any IP address, and then of course over here is the stuff that's kind of hard baked in. You can't really change any of that unless you create one of these from scratch on your own. Now let's take a look at this in a practical sense. Because of the fact that I have port 80 open, and again, I was looking at it, but I haven't modified it. I didn't click OK. I just canceled it out. So it's just the way it is, the way it appeared out of the box, so to speak, when I installed IIS. Now I can make a connection, and you can see here that I've connected to the IP address of that server. And these are just some photographs that I took in the American Southwest this past winter. This is the Grand Canyon after a snowstorm. And there's a couple of shots there of the Grand Canyon after a snowstorm. That's my favorite. I don't know if you can see it very well in this small UI, but that's one of my favorite shots right there. Anyway, and then this is Antelope Canyon further up north. But anyway, this is a website that I have that I'm hosting on that server now. So wouldn't it be nice if I could specify who exactly would be able to access this? Maybe I'm very selfish with my photographs, and I don't want just anybody to look at them. Well, what I could do here is to set up a rule, and we're generally going to use a group policy object to do this. Now, of course, if I wanted my website to be available to only one specific user or computer, I could require the authentication option there, or I could also narrow the scope to a specific IP address, which is what I'm about to do. And I could have done that in WFAS on the interface we were just in. However, in a practical sense, for the most part, web servers are part of a web farm where there might be dozens, hundreds, or maybe even thousands of web servers in that farm. It's not really practical to administer WFAS individually on each one, so I'm going to do that instead using group policy object and link it to the organizational units where my web servers are. Here my domain controller has IIS installed, and that's where my website is hosted. That's not normally a practical function, but in demonstration it is. So I'm going to right click on the firewall policy that I've created, and I'm going to click on edit. As we go into this, we'll just expand down to computer configuration policies, Windows settings, security settings, and then Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, you'll notice that the UI is exactly the same as what we saw on a local level, which makes this very easy to work with. And what we could do with this as well as we go to Properties is we could go to the domain, private, and public profile. The UI, as you can see here, is the same for all of them, and all I have to do is specify whether or not I want the firewall on. Okay, I would recommend that you leave it on, especially if that's what your security policy calls for. So you turn it on, and then you can specify inbound connections, these self-explanatory items which we've looked at in a previous interface. It's really the same thing, just a different UI. We can also specify customized settings here for notifications. Maybe we want to have the notification for applications that are trying to open up a port. Well, that's where we would specify that, for example. And then that's pretty much the basic idea for what we have here. But our main idea is that we want to configure a new inbound rule. So I'm going to choose a new rule. And this would override anything that's set up by default on my web server. For example, remember port 80, and there's a rule for HTTP already configured on my web server when I installed IIS. What I set up here is going to override that. Now, I can show you all of these individually. Let me just explain them briefly. Program does just that. You can specify which program allows a certain port to open. You can specify the port without specifying a program. This would be a TCP or a UDP port. You could do a predefined one, and notice that we already have the HTTP one down here, but that doesn't do me much good because I've already got that on my local server. And then I could do custom, which gives you the most flexibility. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that one for now. So as I do this, I'll click on Next, and then I'll choose it to work with all programs. Or if I had a specific program that I wanted it to work with, I would specify that here as well. It's really more of a service when we're talking about IIS, so that doesn't really apply. And then there's a protocol type. It's going to be TCP port 80. So it's not all ports, it's a specific port. And you can see some of the other self-explanatory options there, but it's going to be a specific port 80. And the remote port could be all ports. Not all ports come in on port 80 either. It could open up on any port, and in this case I'm just going to leave it wide open. But the main idea here is that when we connect to their IIS, it's going to be using port 80. Which local IP address does this rule apply to? Well, I've only got one IP address, but some servers are multi-homed, meaning they have more than one network interface. So one might be connected to a management system of some type, a management network, and we don't really want to serve web traffic out of that. The other one might be connected to the internet, and we do want to serve web traffic out of that. So we'd specify a given IP address, then we would add in whichever IP address that was. I'm only using the one IP address anyway, so I'll just leave it at any. And then in this case, this is where we get to our objective, where I want to specify only one computer that is able to connect to this. Let's give it 10.10.10. I think 100 I've got on a Windows 8 computer over there. So let's say this IP address, 10.10.10.100, is the only computer that can connect to this. Notice that I could also choose a predefined set of computers, and these kind of explain themselves as well: WINS, DNS, or DHCP servers, or the local subnet, which could be quite handy if we didn't want to specify the given IP address, especially if we're concerned that that might change in the future. But I'm okay with this fixed IP address for the time being, and then we'll just go ahead and click on Next, and I want to choose Allow the Connection. I can also do Allow the Connection if it is secure, but I would need connection security rules and IPsec in order to make that happen, and I haven't configured that yet, so we'll just leave that off. And really, it's in the domain, but it doesn't really matter to me what these are selected right now. My main point that I want to select is that we're doing this for a specific IP address. So I'm going to say allow HTTP to only 10.10.10.100. Okay, and then that's pretty much the description as well, so I'll just leave it as is and click on Finish. So anyway, there's our new policy. Now, there is still a little bit of a problem here, because if I go back to Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, remember this rule down here? Well, it's still going to apply. So I want to disable that one because I don't really want that one. I want the new one that I have instead. So I'm going to do here is run a GP update, and it should now apply that policy for me. So we see that the computer policy update has succeeded. So if I go back in to Windows Firewall with Advanced Security on the local computer, we'll remember this is disabled now, so that's no issue for us. But we should see, there it is, up at the top, allow HTTP to only that specific IP address. So now if I go to a Windows 8 client, I'm going to open up my web browser. And it's still there because I actually had that open earlier. So let me try to refresh it. If it's blocked from being able to get it, it'll just get an error message. But since it's allowed, because my local IP address here on the machine we're looking at is 10.10.10.100, then as I refresh this, seems to be taking a while. Maybe you have to activate Windows. Maybe Microsoft hobbles Internet Explorer and your internet activity until you actually activate Windows. Alright, anyway, finally, there it finally pops up. So we're able to access it. Why? Because again, the firewall rule allows my local IP addresses, which is .100, to connect to this machine. Now, if I go to another browser here, I've got another browser open on my desktop, which is at .21. Obviously, that's not .100. So should I be able to connect or not? Let's see. 10.10.10. The web address is at .70. So try to open this up. What we're going to eventually see, it's actually going to go to Google, I think. If it can't get this open, then it just Googles for this IP address. And sure enough, it's Googling for that, whatever these guys are. Anyway, so we're not able to access that particular address, but we can on the machine that we did allow it to on the firewall rule. And then going back into Windows Firewall with Advanced Security on the local server where the web service is hosted. Remember, I disabled this item. And one thing I do want to point out is that if I had left that enabled, it would still allow access, as I mentioned earlier. So what you might want to do to mitigate that is you would have to set up your own rules, but very, very specifically. And you would go to the properties that we looked at earlier, where we'd go to the settings, and we would say whether under rule merging, whether or not we wanted the default local firewall rules to apply or not. And I would have to say no, and then only specific settings that I configure for firewalls within this group policy object would apply. You have to be careful of that because you can accidentally block out certain things you don't want to block out. And the other thing you should be aware of, although I don't think you need to know the finest level of detail with it, is the connection security rules, which is really IPsec. Okay, there's a couple of places to configure IPsec. One of these is down here, IP security policies on Active Directory, and there's 3 basic rules there. Client respond only, which means no security will be enabled unless a server replies with one of these policies, which is secure server requires security. So in other words, if you will not reply to me with security, IPsec security, talk to the hand. Okay, require security. The server here says request security. So that says, you know, if you can have the capability to reply with IPsec data and authentication, we'll go ahead and communicate that way. Otherwise, we'll just communicate unsecured. Now, the reason why you would do that is some older clients or non-Windows clients might not understand IPsec or have compatibility issues. Okay, so the most secure way to communicate would be to have your desktop clients, for example, have respond only. That way they don't have to require security to just browse the internet or do something else innocuous like that. The servers, though, that have protected data will require it. So nobody will ever get data off of those servers unless they're using IPsec to authenticate themselves and then also to potentially encrypt that data. Now, this is more information than we need for our current purposes as we go back to connection security rules. And before we get more detail there, I want to talk to you more about how IPsec can actually be used. Okay, so here's just an example, and again, it's more data than we really need, but here we have a SQL server right over here, and let's say it has certain kinds of financial data on it. Okay, we do want our finance folks to access some of that data, although not all of it, just a small portion of it. And the salespeople have no business whatsoever getting into our SQL server with our finance data on it. As nosy as they are, we're just not going to allow it. Okay, so what we could do is to set up our sales users. We would create a group policy object and link it to their organizational unit that would say Kerberos respond only. That means only use respond only. That was the same setting I just showed you over here. Okay, where you look down here, it would be respond only. And it doesn't have to be this exact policy. You can actually create other ones that are similar to what's already there. Okay. Anyway, so that's going to be respond only, and you can use Kerberos to identify who you are. All right. Then here for finance, well, guess what? We don't want them to access all of the data, so they can't communicate directly with the SQL server. Instead, we have our SQL developers and our web developers work a specific web app, and they cobble it together that will get only a specific narrow scope of that SQL data into a web page that our finance people can then use. It's kind of a peephole to specific SQL data. Yeah, our finance folks We knew it. They're all peepers. Oh, shame on them. Anyway, so they're able to access this web page just exactly the way we want to. And of course, there's other things you can do like SQL permissions and all kinds of other SQL tricks you can use. But this is how we're doing it, is through this web page. So the way we make this work is we don't want the sales folks to access this web server either. So how do we make that work? Well, we take these two servers and we set up very specific rules for them. First of all, the SQL server is going to block traffic from everybody, including you, but not you. Okay, it's going to require security from this web app server. All right, the web app server is also going to block all traffic from everybody. Okay, so it's blocked from you. Blocked from you, and blocked from you even. Okay, it's not going to actually be able to go that direction. However, it's going to require security from the finance organizational unit. And since they have respond only, then what's going to happen is they try to talk to this web page. The web server here is going to say, hey, we have to talk securely. It'll establish a secure connection over IPsec and deliver the web page. And of course, again, there's other things you can do like HTTPS and stuff like that. But that's how we're doing it here. Although it actually just occurred to me, we'll have to block traffic from everybody except for require security from finance. And then I didn't put it in here, but we'd also have to require security from the SQL server. Okay, so it'd have to go that way actually as well. All right, so anyway, these are specifically not exam objectives that we have. However, this one is. I do think that these are going to be on other exams further on in the Windows Server 2012 series, though. Now, the connection security rules we have here, I would just know these basic rules that appear in the first page of the wizard and kind of what their purpose is. The isolation rule is probably one of the most useful ones, and it, for example, could be used to make sure that only members of my domain can communicate with this server. So if we have a visitor in our network that's connected to our Wi-Fi or whatever, they will not be able to make a connection because we're requiring isolation. In other words, using IPsec methods, only domain members will be able to communicate with this server. My visitor who's not a domain member will not. Although, maybe I've got somebody else that's visiting my company, but we work with them in partnership, and they're working on a special project with us. That one person does need to communicate with the server, so we might make an authentication exemption, and we can enter in only their laptop computer as an exemption so that they don't have to use IPsec to be able to make that connection. Next, you would have server to server, where you have two specific servers that you want to protect the connection to. There's also tunnel, and with this one, it's similar to server, except it's usually for endpoints. For example, maybe two gateways between two local area networks separated by an internet connection or a wide area connection. So that might be an example of that one. And then custom means you can configure all of the configuration settings to your liking. So I'm going to go back up here to the isolation rule just because that's a very commonly used one, and we'll just take a look at the kinds of things you can do. You can either request or require authentication for inbound connections and outbound connections. You can kind of see the examples here of the various types. I'm going to just say, let's just make it really hard-nosed here and say require authentication for inbound and outbound connections. And then what kind of connection method or authentication method could we use? We could require Kerberos version 5 for computer and user, or just a computer, or you can specify advanced, which gives you kind of into the dark arts of IPsec, but we'll just use computer and user for the time being. And then we looked at this type of thing earlier. Let's leave it for all of them, but in most cases, actually, for this type of thing, actually, let's do it this way. More practically speaking, we would use it for domain only, because after all, we're requiring domain authentication. So somebody in the airport on their laptop's not going to be able to authenticate against my domain anyway. And then that's pretty much it. Now you would just give it a name, and it would then have security requirements for any connections. Another thing to observe here, and it's part of the exam objectives, is that you can import or export policy. Now I'm doing this in the Group Policy Management Editor, but we can also do it in the local WFAS on a local machine as well. But you just right-click on it and you choose Export, and then you specify where you want it to go. I'll just call this, my firewall. Okay, something like that. And then I successfully exported it. Now, I'm going to go back to my inbound rules that I created. I'm just going to delete this and pretend as if, actually bring it back to an unconfigured state. Now, if I were to import policy, I could go back to the import policy item here, and it's going to overwrite previous settings if I had any. So I'm just going to go back to my firewall here and open. And now we see that the policy has been successfully imported, and there's our rule back in place. And that might be useful if you have a specific policy that you want to transfer to a different department. Maybe they're not part of your domain or you don't have access to their group policy objects, but you want them to be able to access the policy that you came up with. And there could be dozens of different settings within this thing. Much easier to export it and import it than to recreate the whole thing from scratch. This nugget was pretty simple. We really talked about one thing, and that was how to configure Windows Firewall. Remember, you can do that locally using the control panel item, but it's very essential, very general, and not really a lot of detail in it. Or you can use Windows Firewall with advanced security. It's much better, however, if you use group policy objects to configure your firewall policies. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.